Hey guys, this is Pastor Caleb, and welcome to our new Thursday night series as we get into answers for some of life's more difficult questions. On Thursday nights, we're going to be starting a series here with Professor or Dr. Sean McDowell. We got his permission. He is an apologetics professor over at Biola. Some of you guys might know his dad, Josh McDowell, who wrote a really famous book. Um, Sean has been putting out content weekly for a long time, and I have just been a great fan of some of the discussions, the guests, the people that he brings on, because I feel like he really is trying to equip us, the church, with resources for how we can engage in the world. We're going to do a Thursday night series where each week we're going to put out one of these discussions or interviews that he's done and try to equip you so that we can be salt and light, so that we can be ready to give an answer to the hope that we have. I hope that you're blessed. I hope that you enjoy these on Thursday nights, and then we can follow up if you have questions, if you have prayer requests. You can always text the church, 714-879-3314. We'll also include a link to Sean's YouTube channel where you can find hundreds of videos on everything from how to share your faith to topics like these to a whole bunch of different resources that he has there on his channel. Again, we hope that you're blessed. We hope that you enjoy this, and we hope that you'll join us on Sunday mornings at 10 and 12 as we continue to unfold God's word to answer life's most difficult questions. All right, enjoy.
How is artificial intelligence transforming sexuality in porn today? Whether it's the creation, whether it's the consumption or distribution, it's no exaggeration to say, in my estimation, that we are stepping into a new revolution that we will look back on in probably 2 to 3 to 5 years and realize that things just completely shifted underneath our feet. Well, I'm not remotely qualified to talk about all this, but my friend today, Christopher Lind, is someone I consider an artificial intelligence and business expert. He is a Christian and has a lane outside of the Christian world, helping people navigate changes in business and the economy and artificial intelligence, but was willing to come on and take some of the toughest questions that I have for him about this topic. And then we're going to take your questions live. So, Christopher, thanks for coming on, man.
Sean, it has been a pleasure. I've been looking forward to this, and the live is always the best because you never know what people are going to ask, and it's adds a flare of energy to it. So I've been looking forward to it.
Now, we were both talking about how the two of us in different ways try not to be alarmists and try to be a mediating voice on issues. And yet at times I am kind of alarmed. And you and I had a conversation that's posted on Tuesday on a separate podcast that I co-host out of Biola. And when we were done with that conversation, I had two thoughts. I said, number one, got to have you on here for my audience. Number two, I was jarred by that, Christopher. I don't think I understood how radically things are shifting and what this means for the church and the culture. How concerned are you, even though we haven't gotten into the issues, in terms of how much artificial intelligence is transforming sexuality and specifically pornography?
So I'm not an alarmist, and largely I think that came from growing up in a funeral home. So death is kind of normal to me, so nothing really gets me too shaken. But I am legitimately concerned about this one big time. And really, it's why I spend so much time talking about technology, because there are so many subtle implications of it that people just don't understand. And that's what really concerns me, is there's a lot happening in the technology space and people don't understand how it works. And so they think in these kind of extreme categories, and that's not actually what shifts behavior. It's these subtleties that slowly eke their way in. And all of a sudden, something that didn't seem like that big of a shift, suddenly you're on the other side and you didn't even realize you were there. And that's what I'm seeing, especially in this space and a lot of the AI space, that it does create a fair amount of alarm for me, but more in the sense of, hey, folks, you just need to understand this so that you can be prepared and understand the world we're walking into. Because the bottom line is, train's out of the station. There's no going back. It's not a how do we stop it? It's a how do we prepare for it and mitigate the risk?
All right, well, let's do this. This is the first time I've done a live stream in 8 months. And sometimes on a topic like this just makes me nervous. It's such a sensitive
Yeah.
topic, but it's vital. I want to do it as quickly as possible. And I want questions from our audience as well. Now, this morning I read an article in the Washington Post, and here's a quote. It says, "Now a new shift is on the horizon. Artificial intelligence models that spin up photorealistic images and videos that put viewers in the director's chair, letting them create whatever porn they like." Now, my thoughts are, and we talked about this last time, is in the past up until now, with the internet, so maybe the past 20 years, basically if somebody could think of some kind of porn scene or experience, you could find that somebody had created it. So you think of it,
Yep.
you go find it. Somebody's already made it. Now things are shifting. That if you think of it, we have the technology now that you are in the director's chair and you actually can create it. Is that
Yeah.
fair, whether it's about videos, erotic literature, that captures the shift that is now taking place?
Yeah, and I think that's where sometimes when I talk with people, they go, well, why is this really all that different? Because all this stuff exists today. But I think about how the internet changed the pornography industry, in that before there were more barriers to it and it was harder to access. And so there was a little more of a taboo around it. Suddenly it was at your home computer and you could find, like you said, whatever you wanted. And then it was on your mobile device. And now we're moving into this next generation where it's like, whatever you want on demand. Now, granted, the folks who are, in the space, or if you've been following image gen or video gen, it's not quite what some of the headlines would think. So
Okay.
we're not quite at the point where you can just say, I want this, and magically you have a 30-minute video that's doing this. We're not there yet. But when it comes to image generation, when it's coming to early video generation, we are very much there. And even some of the implications of now, with you look at OpenAI's voice response, the fact that you can now talk in real time. And I think that's something that we have never experienced quite on this level, where you can just interact with it and it feels like you're speaking to another human being, and you can get it to do whatever you want. And I think that level of personalization we have never experienced, which just makes what is already a very dangerous thing that much more dangerous and that much more addictive.
But that's coming, right? So whether even on
Oh,
ChatGPT right
yes.
now, imagine somebody could say, hey, make an erotic literature around this story, whatever it is, and it spins a short story, a longer one. But even the video kind and eventually an immersive experience, we will be there soon, where somebody can literally create it with tools without actors, without a studio, with video that blurs the line between reality and fiction. Are we headed there?
Yes. Oh,
Okay.
yeah. And we're already at the point where there are some applications, some things out there now where you could have an erotic digital partner that you can talk with, and it will respond and essentially give you whatever you want. So it's already there. It just hasn't quite gone mainstream to the point. And I think that's what a lot of people don't realize. They're like, I've used ChatGPT. I don't really see how all that would work. And that's, I think, the concern is it's just subtly eking its way in.
Okay, so let's come back to ways that you think this might shift culture in the church and sexuality. But I want to talk about first, how is AI changing the distribution of pornography? Because there's the creation, there's the distribution, and then there's the consumption of it. We talked a little bit about the creation, but what about the distribution? Is the porn industry going to use AI in new ways to distribute pornography, potentially to new markets in ways that it hasn't been done before?
So I think there's a couple ways that I would break this down. So AI is complicated in that it's like electricity, in the sense that it kind of is ubiquitous and it's everywhere. So as people are thinking about like how specifically will it change this thing, it's like, well, it's going to change all of it, because in many ways, absolutely everything we do, especially in the digital realm, is going to be influenced and impacted by it. So if we think about the distribution of it, in and of itself, we talked about the subtle shift it's going to make to democratizing being in that director's chair over time, which is going to change the distribution models of how some of this stuff happens. But a lot of the same stuff we've seen in social media and the way I'm not on TikTok, but I've done enough research on it that you don't have to be on TikTok for more than seconds before it knows exactly what you want and what's going to keep you hooked and what's going to draw you in. And it's constantly learning and evolving in a way that makes it so addictive, you literally almost psychologically can't remove yourself from it. And so as you think about those distribution channels and the way it can get to know you and start recommending and actually presenting you with things that you might not have even realized you wanted to see or engage with before you even realized it happened.
So I wonder if it's going to work like this. So artificial intelligence could say if somebody looks at A, 92% of the time they next start searching B. They start searching B, 84% of the time they start searching C. And rather than a natural progression that people tend to go down, they can anticipate this and feed this to people and speed it up and almost manipulate the direction that people go without their being manipulated. And I mean from things like nudity to sex to group sex to far more violent and twisted kind of sexuality. Is that the kind of manipulation that you think artificial intelligence could do to people looking at pornography?
I absolutely think that's already happening, and that absolutely will continue. But I think some of the other things, because when you think about it, I think sometimes we think about it as an industry as though it's this own unique thing. And the thing about working in as many different business industries as I have is all businesses run very similarly. And so ultimately, it's about market penetration. It's about, beating out your competitors. It's about making as much money as humanly possible at the lowest cost. So a lot of the motivators that a lot of the businesses I work with are trying to use AI to account. How do we become more efficient? How do we automate? Things like that. How do we get better analytical and make data-driven decisions? The industry's not any different. They're thinking the same way about this. And so one of the other things is you're looking at expanding your market share. You're looking for how do we attract audiences we couldn't reach before? And in this industry in particular, part of this personalization, part of the reason it's so dangerous is now instead of having to create something that caters to the masses, you can start to say, well, we can actually cater to anybody at any point. And now what markets are we not tapping into? Or what behavioral patterns can we see in people? Like you said, where we go, okay, we wouldn't have known this. We would have assumed this group would have gone down this path. Actually, if we change things this way, we can actually attract a new audience who might have been repelled by things in the past and lead them to something else. And it's not necessarily like people in a evil conference room going, well, how do we destroy society? They're just thinking people want it. We make a lot of money doing it. So how do we make more money and how do we distribute this to a larger audience?
So you and I have overlapping concerns. We're both Christians. We both have like a weekly cultural update in different angles. And yet I work through Biola University for a Christian seminary, and that's not your primary lane. In my lane in the Christian world, the vast majority of people have moral concerns with pornography. That's not a debate. But there started to be a shift that I was aware of. In 2016, Barna had a study that my father's ministry actually commissioned with him. And I got to make sure I got the numbers right, but I think they asked Gen Z, like those 13 to 24, what's worse, to look at pornography or to not recycle? And if I remember correctly, if I got this wrong, somebody just post it in the correct this. I think it was
fact checkers will find it.
Just fact checkers, but I think it was like 56% to like 32 said not recycling is worse than looking at pornography. And that was Gen Z as a whole. So there's been a shift in acceptability outside of the Christian world. I know you've talked about this at times in your cultural update. How much do you sense acceptability? In fact, I heard somebody say, though it's worse to judge somebody for looking at porn than to look at porn itself.
So what's interesting about the lane that I swim in is that my audience primarily I'm not necessarily talking to Christian audiences. And so I typically don't lead with that. Although a lot of people know that's kind of how I'm making value judgments and things like that.
Sure.
I tend to make a lot more arguments from just what is the sociological data showing us? right now, and what are we seeing, and how can I argue out of natural law against this? And one of the things that's interesting right now is we've definitely reached a point where, yes, it's culturally acceptable, almost more, not as that people are proud of it, but it's just one of these, it is so, I saw a study the other day that like 9 in 10 men are actively involved with pornography, and 6 in 10 women are actively involved in pornography. So at that level of adoption, I guess you would say, it just becomes a thing where the culture goes, I mean, what are we going to do? It's just like what you do. And I have had my own struggles over the years. And I remember I grew up in an environment that very much was like, well, it's better than cheating on your wife, it's better than, and we make a lot of these excuses for why it's okay. So I think we are there. But one of the things that's really encouraging is I spent a lot of time talking to Gen Z and even some Gen Alpha folks. And there is starting to be this awakening that I think is coming out of hookup culture, which is this is really empty and unfulfilling. And this whole just objectifying sex is just this act that we just do, and it just gives us it's leaving us feel hollow. So I am encouraged that I am seeing more, especially the younger generation, starting to go, I don't know that I'm buying this line, that this is good for me, that it's in my best interest. But I think we've got this problem now where it's so ubiquitous, it's very hard to pull out of. And then you've got AI making it exponentially more addictive and personalized, that there's a real war going on right now.
It's always hard to know the amount of, but I saw a study this morning that's like people are looking at major porn sites more than Amazon and Netflix and all these huge sites that people are using daily. So if 90% are active users, this is more ubiquitous than many people realize. Now, of course, when we say active users, some define that as once a month, others are like daily. So these are just important nuances to take into consideration.
Sure. But I think we also got to take in mind, like, if you think about TikTok or some of these other things, like, where do we draw the line on what is pornography? And that's the thing, is we have created a culture that is hypersexualized, where we go, well, I don't look at the hardcore stuff. I don't do this. And it's like, well, how are you making arbitrary judgments on what's socially acceptable and not? And I think that's a line AI is even going to further blur, because it's like, well, it's not real. It's not a real person. And suddenly now that sense inside of us that leaves that kind of sick, hollow feeling where you go, I know I shouldn't be doing this, and it's not making me satisfied, but somehow I can't seem to get around it. It's just going to make it harder.
That's such a fair point. We're seeing this legally as well when it comes to like child pornography. Is it illegal to distribute images that are artificially created or not? That's some of the territory. And I don't want to wade too much into the legal side of it, but in Ashcroft versus Free Speech Coalition in 2002, it was determined that, quote, virtual child pornography, referring to images and videos appearing to depict minors, but not produced using actual minors, was protected by the First Amendment and thus could not be banned. Yet there was a Canadian man who was jailed reportedly for creating child porn. So we are seeing this. As far as I can tell, these are some of the questions that we're asking. What is pornography? What's the line between art and between pornography? What is real? And there was a case with some junior high boys that were taking images of girls, these are minors, and kind of using artificial intelligence to create
they're undressing
scenes
apps
with them. And this was as devastating to the girls as if these images were real. And so, I mean, it's just, it's devastating what's at our fingertips, which never was in the past. All right, friends, you're listening to Christopher, Lind, and I talk about how artificial intelligence is transforming the sexual landscape. We're going to get into deepfakes and some of these other open issues. But if you have a question, put in caps question. And if it relates to what we're talking about, I will try to weave it in and make sure we ask our resident expert for today. So we talked about the creation of pornography because of AI. We talked about the distribution a little bit. What about the consumption? is this going to change the way people consume porn? In a sense, will it make it more interactive? Will it blur the line between consumer and participant? What's happening now and where are we headed in terms of consuming pornography?
So this one's kind of interesting in that some of the headlines you'll see, and I saw one the other day about, China's actively in the production of sex robots that have AI embedded into it, where you can physically interact and socially interact with a completely artificial person that responds and interacts in a human way. What I think is dangerous about looking at that is people jump to that extreme and go, well, I would never. That's so out there. That's so bizarre. And I would never do that. And I think that's where it's more the subtleties that I get more concerned about, where I go, but there are things I already know people are engaging with for entertainment purposes or something like that. And one of the ones I talked about on my cultural update a couple of weeks ago was this influencer on Instagram who, in a attempt to reach her audience more, she created an AI version of herself. It was just a voice, but that way, when you messaged her Instagram account, it would respond as if it was her. And if you go into it, and this is where a lot of people just don't understand how these models are trained. And so they go, well, we just train it out of it. And you're like, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work. And so she had trained an algorithm specifically with some guardrails. And let's just say she had to shut the whole thing down because as she started looking at the logs, the chat logs of what people were saying and what her AI Instagram version was actually initiating. It wasn't even just people's responses. It was this AI bot initiating to try and attract people in. And I think that's the kind of subtleties where people start going, oh, I saw a site the other day, and I'm not even going to give it the dignity of naming it, where you could go talk to any of your favorite cartoon characters. Well, you look at the site and you look at the cartoon characters and you're like, this is not like the way you are marketing this is not like, oh, wouldn't it be so fun to talk to Garfield? Like, no, like you're trying to lure in people to talk to this. And of course, this is the kind of stuff where somebody goes, I'm just going to experiment with this. Wouldn't it be kind of fun if I could just talk to this? And pretty soon the conversation goes sideways. You try and see how far you can push it, or the model initiates it back and you play into it. And I think those are some of the subtleties to this. I've talked to somebody the other day who they kind of started getting hooked on it because they started playing with image generation in AI. And suddenly, oh, what if I just, wouldn't it be funny if it could do this? And before you know it, you start going down the waterfall and it does not end well.
There's a great question here from Noah about the future challenges for the church. I promise you we will get there. I think we need to lay out some of what's really going on before we can lay out how the church could respond. Great question, Noah. I see it. We will come back to that. I promise. I appreciate you anticipate where we're headed on this. Now, one question that was hinted at earlier is that, pornography might shift and change our tastes. So there's always a debate with movies. Like, does wider culture reflect what we already believe and want, or does it shape what we believe and want? And my dad has tend to say, well, it reflects it. And I tend to say, no, it shapes it. The reality is it's probably both. There's evidence that both is the case. So with this shift into AI, where people can create their own kinds of pornography, where it's becoming more and more immersive, where it's becoming more and more personalized. Do you have any ways you've seen this already shift how people think about sexuality, or any thoughts on where this might even go?
Yeah. So I've spent a lot of time in studying psychology and cognitive behavior as part of the work that I do, and so I'm very much an advocate that this will shape people. And I don't need to make an argument on the hypothetical, because I know from even one of your cultural updates, one of the things that came up was how violent sexual activity between two people has already risen exponentially. and how choking has become normative
Oh,
because of violence and things like that. And there's enough data out there showing that engaging with pornography, and I can just say from my own experience as a young kid, I didn't start with crazy stuff. It started with, the swimsuit issue of this, which slowly, that doesn't get you the same high. And so when we study human behavior and the connections, it's very simple. We see the same thing with drug habits and things like that. You don't start on the far end, but slowly the same satisfaction you got with something small doesn't quite get you there. And so you need to experiment to the next level. And pretty soon you start to go a little bit further. And what AI is going to allow you to do is it's going to allow you to move there way faster. And you're going to remove a lot of the barriers that maybe prevented you from going there before, because suddenly, that might be a little too far for me. Suddenly it's like, well, but not really, because it's not real. And maybe I'll just experiment this one time and things like that. And you can do it on the fly. And I think about how the lack of accountability that mobile devices has given, where you can do this secretly and nobody needs to know. And now we're going to get to a point where you're going to have access to these AI tools. You're literally creating it on the fly. So there's no record to anyone that this has ever happened except to you. And that kind of privacy just creates an environment that encourages people to push the boundaries yet a little bit further than they maybe would have if they had to Google search it, just out of fear that what if somebody came across my Google search history? Well, now I don't need to worry about that because I'll create it on the fly, I'll delete it, and I don't have to worry about it because I'll just create a new one when I need to. And that kind of anonymity is extremely dangerous. And that's not just with this. We know this from data about human behavior.
So the internet made, go back really to the 90s. It's made pornography more anonymous, more acceptable, more approved within the culture as a whole. It's more accessible. Now, so there were certain barriers that the internet and social media broke down and hence opened the dam, so to speak. Now, some further, it's like we're on the cusp of another entire level of barriers being removed that'll just speed this up to people. And you and I haven't argued for this here, but ultimately would be more devastating to individuals and to marriages and society and mental health, etc. Okay, now
we have the data, and we have the data to back that from what pornography has already done. And one of the things I talk about all the time with AI is AI doesn't just do things. It accelerates or exacerbates things that are already in place. And so we don't need to guess what AI might do in this sphere. We just need to look at what it has done already, what has already been going on, and just say, okay, so what if we took off all the barriers and strapped a jetpack and a nitrous tank to it? What might happen? And I think then you go, well, geez Louise, I mean, we can predict what's going to happen real quick.
Yeah, I think that's right. So one of the points you made is you compared pornography to certain drugs. And biochemically, there are similarities of the high that we get, certain drugs like dopamine that are released by drugs and by pornography. There's overlap that's there. There's differences. Like when it comes to pornography, it's just viewing. Of course, drugs get into your bloodstream, which makes pornography many times that much more addictive because the high can be instant. But I'm curious if you agree with this. One of the differences between drugs and pornography is if you get a high from a certain drug, you need a harder drug or more of it to get the same high. And yet when it comes to pornography, it's not quantity. It's what you might say quality in the sense of its variety that now brings that similar high that one had before. So if to get back to that same high, artificial intelligence knows what variety you need to get back there. It can literally be wired in a certain way that matches our brains and is built even more than social media is to manipulate us and make it habitual and addictive. Agree or disagree?
Exactly. I completely agree. And then on top of it, you stack on top of it what we know, and as Christians, we know, like, we aren't inherently good. So now on top of it, even if the algorithm gets it wrong, you can go, well, actually, this is what I want. And you have the control to speak it into existence, to type it into existence. So now you've got two things working against you because you've got these powerful machines trying to automate it for you so you don't even have to think. And then even if it gets it wrong, you can go, actually, you know what? Change this. I actually want to see this now. And on the fly, you don't even have to like go look for something else. You can literally modify what's happening in real time.
Hmm. Okay, so you brought in human sinfulness. So I think this is a good time to bring this question in. As I was reading just some articles, kind of prepping for this a little bit, there were quite a few people much more optimistic than I am that said things like pornography with artificial intelligence can be a tool to facilitate diversity and inclusion. And of course, those terms have a certain meaning in our culture that you and I would differ with. I don't want to necessarily get into that, but using it as a positive tool to better shape society, I look at that and I almost laugh out loud. I go, are you kidding me? Actually, pornography is advancing certain sexual stereotypes about race, for example. There's a number of studies that show the way that whites and blacks and Asians are often portrayed in pornography to advance certain stereotypes. So do I think the goodness of human beings using artificial intelligence is going to lead towards greater understanding and openness and diversity? I go, no. This is actually probably going to propagate some of the bad stereotypes that are in our hearts that we want to get rid of. I think it's going to make it worse. Do you agree with that?
So I think yes, and here's how I respond to that, because I get I get people who, again, I talk to a large audience that isn't all Christians, and so a lot of times I get the pushback on things that, you know, they're looking at it going, well, isn't it good for this reason? Doesn't it help in this? And so with this one specifically, one of the things that I've found is really helpful to help people illustrate this is one of the things that's most painful about stereotypes and something like that is somebody else placing on you what they think of you. And they're putting that on you. And what artificial intelligence is doing is actually giving them 1,000 times more power to do that. So if this person is racist and this is how they feel about you, they can now create imagery and visuals and all this stuff of whatever that negative thing is. They're not going to suddenly go, you know what, I'm going to make a balanced, more, you know, diverse. No, it's actually, it's going to give them what they want. And what they want isn't those things that you think what you want. I get that might be what you want, but you're actually empowering those people to exploit and demoralize people that they didn't have before.
Which is like social media. It doesn't favor positive images or posts. It's those who rile people up and have anger and high emotions, which tend to be on negative things. Artificial intelligence is going to manipulate that. So bring out our worse angels, not our better angels. I think that's for sure. Now, let me ask you this question. Some people make the argument that artificial intelligence will be good. What's your take on jobs? Like somebody could say, well, even I guess a Christian could make this argument. I haven't heard one, but I imagine they could say, well, with artificial intelligence, there'll be less need for actual sex workers. And this will limit that negative effect that sex work has on somebody's life. And I mean sex work specifically in the adult film industry. Do you think, I guess it's a two-part question. How would you respond to somebody who says that's good? And do you actually think it'll result in less of jobs, or will there be more desire for the quote real because of this artificial stuff?
So I totally am empathetic and understand where the line of thinking comes from. And that's where I have encountered that argument a lot. And I don't get mad about it because I'm like, I totally get it. It seems like this digital technology is actually going to be a benefit because there's a lot of people I know who hate the idea of people being exploited and made to do things that they don't want to do and all this stuff. And so I genuinely believe the people who are advocating for that truly believe that. And they go, isn't this a good thing though? Because now aren't people not going to be exposed to that? I think really where it fundamentally breaks down, it goes back to people not understanding how this technology works. So I'll get to the point you brought up, but I think there's something even underneath that many people don't understand. And that is that technology doesn't just create and train itself. It needs massive amounts of real things to train itself on. It can't go, just as a lighthearted example, go ask generative AI to create an image of someone doing gymnastics and watch what it creates. It's just pure ridiculousness because it doesn't have enough data to even understand the complexity of human movement to generate an image that works. It needs more images, it needs more real-time data to actually be trained to do it effectively. And so, if anything, if you look at the amount of data that is required to train these things, if anything, it may require even more exploitation of real human beings to actually perfect the models. And they may need to go find more people to be able to do things they never asked them to do because, oh man, the model malfunctioned and it wouldn't give people this thing they want. We need some more real human data to feed into it to be able to get that right. So there's that. Then on top of it, one of the things that people don't understand, and I talked about this in a weekly update the other day, is training AI requires a lot of people. And as a result, a lot of people get exploited as a result of this. And I've had some friends who have worked in this industry, and it's pretty despicable in terms of data workers who are forced to be exposed to things to say, oh, it's getting this wrong. And they're exposed to things that are catastrophic. And we're now opening the industry to a new segment of employees that didn't have to work in that anymore. Because now we're saying, well, now not only do we need more humans to create data to feed the model, we need more humans to review and analyze all the stuff that it created to then see, is it good? Is it bad? It needs feedback, all this stuff. So we're actually creating a bigger problem to it. Now, then you stack on top of that what you said, which is, okay, then also anybody who's ever looked at porn knows that hollow, empty feeling it leaves you with. It just drives you one step further and one step further. And you want that human connection. But now, when that human connection happens, what kind of expectation and behavioral attributes are you going to expect from that experience? Because now you've been groomed and trained by AI that has given you absolutely everything you want. So I fully anticipate the human interaction will be even more violent and grotesque over time because people will go, well, this is what I got from AI. Why won't you do it? I expect that now. And I think that's where there's almost a three-pronged approach, but I understand the argument comes from usually a really sincere place of people going, I don't like what's happening. Won't this be good? And that's kind of the three things I look at that I go, I understand, but if you understood the technology and human behavior, you would realize that argument doesn't hold a lot of water.
First off, Christopher, I love that you try to see why people hold arguments charitably. I try to do that, not always perfectly myself, but I really appreciate that about you. Let's go to a question here. And before we do so, I hadn't thought of the angle that this creates more people, because I've talked with police officers and detectives who will say, when there's cases on pornography and child pornography, somebody actually has to review these cases. And it can be jarring to the people who watch it. You're like, even if you're a police officer or a lawyer or somebody analyzing this, you're still looking at it. And it's affects you in incredibly negative ways. This technology that's growing out there creates more and more people that have to watch this and judge this and affects them negatively. I think that's right, which in a sense brings us perfectly to this next question. Let's jump ahead and look at this question here. I'll give you my thoughts on this, and then I'd love to know what you think. Mitchell says, what would you say to someone who claims that viewing AI porn is not degrading or exploitative because it is not a real person performing the shot? Here's what I would say, and then weigh in. I would say, yes, presumably it's not a real person, but there are real persons who made this, maybe images of real persons who are used at some fashion in the creation of it. So this didn't arise naturally. But second, looking at porn, AI or not, affects our brains and affects our minds. The data is clear, and I talk about this in my talk on pornography, is that looking at porn shapes us to objectify others. Now, we often hear that what happens in the bedroom stays in the bedroom. But that's false for so many reasons, whether it's STDs or kids that you produce in the bedroom don't stay in the bedroom. But it's also not true in terms of it affects our worldview. The brain can't always tell, oh, this is just AI and compartmentalize it in fiction from, oh, what is real. It overlaps. So if you look at pornography, it's creating a script in your mind and in your brain to see human beings as objects that you use for your own pleasure rather than people to love. And the data is clear on this. Men and women, it turns others into objects. The way we talk about them, the way we look at them, the way we treat people, it shapes our brains and shapes our worldview and is going to affect the rest of society negatively. Now, I would also say if somebody views AI, any kind of pornography, I often tell students, I say, if you click on anything and spend your time on it, you are voting with your time, giving more clicks and attention and potentially money to produce more pornography by clicking on it, which in turn is kind of polluting the well and contributing to the negativity that porn causes in society. Those are two things that came to my mind. Maybe you disagree with those. You can think of something else. How would you answer that question?
So I think my answer would depend on who I was talking to, which is usually the case. I think one of the first things that comes to mind on this is if I'm talking to a Christian, I just am always brought back to the Sermon on the Mount, where it's like, if anyone even so much as looks at someone with lust in their heart, you've committed adultery. So like if you're talking to a Christian, it's like, I don't care if you're looking at an AI bot. I don't care if you're looking at a soda can. Like if you're looking at it with lust in your heart, you are committing adultery with that. And that's a serious, serious thing and not something that should be taken lightly. But where I have a lot of empathy for this response is even the number of people I know who don't share my worldview, who know they're slaves to this, and they hate it. They hate every single time they go back to it. They walk away going, why did I do this again? They maybe won't present that publicly because you're supposed to pretend it's normal and it's fine. But deep inside, they hate it. And I've worked in construction and a number of different industries with people who it was just the normal culture. And when we really got to it, it's like, I hate this, but I'm trying to make myself somehow feel better about it because it makes me feel disgusting. And so I got to justify it. And so I understand where it's like, but isn't it better? Cause like, it's not really a person. But I think the point that I brought up before of like, there were a lot of human beings who were exploited and taken advantage of to make that thing. And you're fueling that system. You are ultimately fueling that system. And again, to your point, I do a lot of research in immersive tech. And when you look at immersive technology, we've studied how the brain interacts with immersive environments. And our brains do not distinguish between the digital world and the real world. There is no difference. I've done a ton of immersive simulations with people, and we've studied the data on how people respond and the cognitive effects on them. You cannot differentiate the two. Your brain does not distinguish. And so while in your head you might go, oh, it's not having the same effect on me, it's not doing these things because it's not real. Your brain does not know that.
That's right.
And so all the chemical, biological, psychological, emotional, all of those things, your body is still responding to it no different than if it was a human being. And I think that's one of the things that makes you go, okay, well, I at least then have to address this for what it is. And I can't just write this off as, wasn't it innocent? Because it's AI. It's not.
By the way, in the comment section, I see some familiar faces that have not been here for 8 months because I haven't been here for 8 months. Those in favor, those are critics. As long as it stays clean, you are always welcome, and I appreciate the conversation. If you have questions for us, whether you agree with us or disagree, write question in caps, keep it succinct, and we will come back to it. And those waiting, we will talk about solutions that we think can help the church, but it's really important that we lay out some of the scope of the problem and what's going on with AI. When new technology comes out, Christopher, it's interesting to me that Christians are always like, how do I use this to spread the gospel? And I also see porn makers and others saying, how do I use this to advance my cause and my business? Do you have a sense of how much the porn industry is either invested in or driving the development of AI technology, if at all? Or are they just utilizing this technology that is out there, given that it's present? Because my understanding is a lot of technology in the past has been driven by the porn industry coming up with new creative ways to reach more people, to make money, etc. Do you have a sense of that, or are we not in a position where we know
Yeah.
that yet?
So, as you can imagine, I don't have a lot of deep connections into businesses in that field, but I do work in a lot of different industries. And so, what I can say is when you look at it as it's a business. And there isn't a business on the planet that I work with that is not trying to figure out how to maximize AI to improve their bottom line, improve their market share, improve this. So to think, oh, that industry is exempt from it, it's like, no way. There's not a chance that they're ignoring this. Now, in terms of whether they're driving it, that I don't know and I'm not going to speak to. But here's one of the
That's
things that I
fair.
do know. The big AI companies, and this is something a lot of people don't realize, it costs trillions of dollars to make this stuff. So this idea that like, but it's only 20 bucks a month to subscribe to OpenAI, isn't this cheap? It's like, no, these companies have spent trillions of dollars making this stuff. And it's not a charity. They've got to figure out how to make as much money to make up their gains. And if you look at the data centers they're having to build and the research that has to go into advancing these models and all this stuff, they've got to make money. And so these companies, whether they like it or not, are having to explore every avenue for how they
Mm.
can make money. And they will or they'll go out of business. And so that kind of pressure would put any company in a position where they go, okay, we said we weren't going to we were going to keep guardrails because this would go too bad. But boy, we just spent another 500 million on data centers and GPUs to run this stuff. Maybe we should re-explore it. And that was actually one of my biggest concerns when I saw OpenAI so quickly reverse their stance on exploring adult media as one of the channels they were going to go. Because in the beginning, it was, we will not go here. It's too dangerous. It's whatever. Well, money talks. And eventually it reaches a point where people start making excuses going, well, if we don't do it, someone else is going to do it. People want it. There's a whole industry we're missing out on. We're missing out on billions of dollars. And at the end of the day, we got to pay the bills. And I think that's where we're just going to see this become something. It's unavoidable.
Mm. There's a comment here from Out of the Echo that says, I'm an atheist and this stuff scares me. So first off, as an atheist, I'm honored you'd watch my channel. At some point, I'd love to have a conversation, maybe how Christians and atheists and others can find common ground showing concern about this, because this is wider than just evangelical Christians. That's for sure. Now, you mentioned OpenAI, and I was going to ask about that. Last I checked, they were considering allowing users to create AI-generated porn. And I guess the way I look at it, if you go back in the past before, and maybe this continued after pornography was available on the internet, is I grew up traveling with my dad, going to conferences. We'd stay in hotels all the time. And there were so often these boxes that were just sitting there in a hotel with families. Pay a certain amount, you stream this X video, put your credit card in, whatever. And big hotels would use this, and presumably they made a ton of money doing so. Is that the kind of pressure that OpenAI and these other companies are experiencing? And have you seen some of them already kind of give in and move that direction?
They already, I mean, I won't speak specifically to OpenAI because some of the decisions they're making are very shrouded in, controversy and all this other stuff. But I know of plenty of AI providers who have compromised here for the exact pressure you described. I mean, hotels got into that business because it was a huge revenue stream. And again, it fed into all the things that are so profitable. It's anonymous. You can go to a hotel, you can do this, don't have to tell anybody, you pay your bit. Like, what a ripe ground to do that. Well, AI is doing the same thing. So of course the AI companies now are starting to go, man, like there are so many different avenues. And because AI is basically like electricity, it's just powering all these other things. So every company out there in this industry is going, hey, like we'll give you $80 million if you'll just do this kind of stuff. We'll give you all, like, we will pour cash into you. And if you're on the other side and you're not coming from a worldview that says this is not good for society as a whole, those dollars and those ones and zeros are just going to keep making it harder and harder to say no. And the data shows us the adult film and adult entertainment industry, money is not an issue for them. Money is not a concern. And so when you start, I mean, you don't have to just look at this industry to know when people have enough money, they can influence just about whatever they need. And so that's why I think the pressure from the AI companies, when you consider what goes into it, the costs associated with it, and now some of the AI bubble starting to pop and people going, uh-oh. And I think the AI bubble starting to pop is only going to drive more energy to it because you start getting desperate. You start making concessions that you wouldn't have normally made.
Let's take a question here, somewhat a little bit more theological. I'll throw in my 2 cents and then see what you think here, Christopher. Peg says, as I see AI as the biggest offense to God's creation and who we are made in his image. How much will God allow? So I would say a couple of things. I don't know that AI or pornography in a sense, or pornography created through AI, is the biggest offense to God's creation. I think idolatry is the worst. Idolatry is the greatest sin. Now, can AI become idolatrous? Of course it can. It can be a tool for good. It can be a tool potentially for bad. It's how we use it. But I wouldn't say AI in itself, as far as I understand it, is an offense to God. So when I look at porn created by AI, God designed sex as being good. He's the one who made it as a gift, made it pleasurable for a reason and a blessing. He's the designer. But what we do is we take and we corrupt and we twist something that's good in Genesis 1, twisted in Genesis 3, then it becomes an idol for us. And we can do that with money. We can do that with a lot of things. Now, I don't think all sins are equal, but every single time sexual immorality is included in vice lists and consistently used as a sin that keeps us away from from the kingdom of God. So idolatry is the worst. But I think because we are sexual beings and it's so ubiquitous and sex, according to God's design, is so good and so beautiful, this is one of the greatest things that AI is going to be used to twist and corrupt. And I would often say create a negative effect on individuals and on society. How do you see it? What are your thoughts on this question?
I really love that you connected to idolatry because I've heard the arguments and I've been involved in them where people say, well, no, tech isn't neutral. AI is not neutral. It's bent towards something. And I would say it is, but it's because of its creators, which is us. And so our bend is towards sin, is towards destruction. That's just our natural bent. So it's no surprise that AI's default posture is similar to ours. Destruction, right? We turn plowshares into swords. Like,
we do.
What? Like, what? Why did we do that? Well, because that's just our natural bend. And we see that in the early chapters of Genesis. Like, hey, let's make a thing up to the heavens and what could possibly go wrong? So I think that idolatry of self-worship, getting whatever we want, being able to do it at a speed and not having to wait for it, I think that's really the biggest risk because I spend a ton of time in this space and work with a lot of companies who are doing incredible things with AI. I just talked to a CEO the other day and they're diagnosing cancer with your breath because AI can take the analysis of what you breathe out and diagnose whether you have cancer versus having to do, a biopsy. So there are so many things that I go, we shouldn't just say AI is going to destroy society. We're going to destroy society. And it's the choices we make over these years and how we choose to use this that I think is the biggest concern.
AI is doing amazing things. I heard on your cultural update maybe a few weeks ago about literally using AI to somewhat come closer to interpreting like whale language and what it means, because it can compare sounds and behavior in ways that humans don't have the capacity to just dissect and make those connections. So AI is incredible. Now, I don't think all technology is morally neutral. I don't think a torture chamber is morally neutral. I think a lot of technology is morally neutral, like a car. It's a good invention. You can use it for good. You can use it to harm people. But we got to realize technology also affects us. Creation of the clock shaped the way we see the world. The watch, air conditioning, planes, the internet, it shapes us. And AI is shaping our relationships, our view of the world, our relationship with God, etc. That's unmistakable. Now, let me ask you
on that one,
yeah,
one
please.
of the things I was going to say that I think was really great with that is even going to your torture chamber example, I would actually say AI is almost a step back of like the wood and the iron and right, these things that you go, okay, so you have all these raw materials. What are you going to do with it? Are you going to build a torture chamber or are you going to build a field and a city for the vulnerable? Like, what are you going to do with it? And I think that's where we are with this, where it's potential. But I think the risk we have to recognize is because it's built by humans and it's trained on human data, it is bent towards chaos. And even secular leaders I know in the tech space would go, yeah, we know. We call it bias because that just sounds like a morally neutral way to say it. But what we're really saying is this thing left unchecked will just completely destroy us.
Fair enough. I appreciate the way you said that. I'm seeing a ton of comments and questions coming here. If you have a question for us, make sure you put question in caps so we can try to weigh in here. I see some in favor of us, some criticism, which is great. We appreciate that. So put question in caps and I can take it to Christopher. Maybe we should shift at this point. And well, let me ask one more question before we go to some things that we can do. Do you have any sense of what we haven't talked about yet of where things are going? And I know this is dangerous because the amount of information, the technology is literally changing overnight. I've heard you say on your weekly cultural update, you'll talk about a story. And then by the next week, it's like defunct because new technology comes out about this.
Yep.
But where do you see any bigger trends on where this might be going, whether it's sex robots, whether it's deep fakes? We didn't even actually talk about deep fakes. Where do you see this moving into the future?
Yeah. So, some of the biggest things that I'm watching right now is if you look at image creation, video generation, specific to this topic, if you look at the advancements in image creation, video generation, humanoid robotics, I mean, if you look at Figure AI's Gen 2 of what they've come out with in 18 months, it is absolutely incredible how far these things have come. OpenAI is talking about Project Strawberry, which is really looking at taking AI to, we're not at what some would call AGI, which doesn't really mean anything or means whatever anybody says it means. But really, we're moving to this more advanced reasoning and logic. And so even some of the stuff where people go, oh, it's really dumb, it makes mistakes all the time right now, it doesn't really feel like I'm interacting with a human being. I think those are the things that I'm going, these are excelling on orders of magnitude that we just don't quite know. Is it going to be a linear flatten out, or is it just going to continue to go up? And I think that's where, what is it going to be in 6 months? I don't even like to make predictions on what it's going to be next month because I keep being surprised by it. But if history is showing how it's been, some people are saying we're going to go into an AI winter, and that's completely possible. But I think we've got a lot more juice to squeeze out of the sponge before we get there. And I think that's where, as we look at some of these things, it's going to get much worse before it gets any better, for sure.
Oh, man. I can't argue with that. That's for sure. Now, there's some theological questions and apologetic questions, which I appreciate because this is an apologetic channel, and I'm tempted to jump into them, but I'm gonna hold off just for staying dialed in here. But if you have specific questions related to technology and artificial intelligence and the Christian worldview, put question in caps and we'll weigh into it. Chris, for this stuff, really, it scares me for the church. It scares me for my own kids. I have 3 kids, 20, 17, and almost 12. What are your thoughts on what the church can do in response to this?
So there's a couple things. One that I've talked about kind of throughout this is there is a fundamental lack of understanding around the technology and how it works. And that to me is one of the biggest risks right now is we've, in some ways, I think the church has kind of said, well, that's not really like a church thing. This is modern technology. The Bible doesn't have a whole lot to say on it. It's like, yes, it does. It actually has a ton to say on this stuff. And so I think leaning into it and actually understanding, how does this stuff work? What are the implications? We should be talking and understanding it more. And it's why I spend so much time creating content about this to try and bring it down to the everyday person's level to go, oh, I mean, I think of a good example of this. I was talking to somebody the other day about it. They didn't know about the exploitation of data workers. They were like, I had no idea that was even a thing. I didn't even know that was a cause for concern. Well, as the church, it certainly should be. We care about widows and orphans. I certainly would think we should care about exploited data workers who are widows and orphans in other countries in inhumane conditions. So sometimes it's just, I didn't know that. Some people don't understand how AI is trained. So they're like, I had no idea this is how this stuff worked or what the risk could be. So I think a lack of education is certainly one of the gaps, and it needs to be spoken about in the church. Because it's not a matter of, oh, culture or society. It's like, no, this is a Christian matter. So I think that's one. I think another one that is really important is, pornography, sexual stuff. It's a weird and uncomfortable topic, I think, for a lot of people. And there's a lot of shame. And honestly, that breaks my heart because a lot of people just are like, I'm struggling with it, but like, I don't want to tell anybody because what are people going to think? And I told you on the one that's dropping with Biola that I had someone reach out to me who said, I feel like you're the only person I can tell because I fell in love with a chatbot and now my wife's leaving me, my family, like my whole life is falling apart. And I feel like everyone else would look at me like I'm some weirdo, but I feel like you'll understand. And I think we need to have more grace and charity for people to be able to talk about it, and not just AI, but just the real struggles of life, the veneer and social media culture we've created where everything's great all the time as the world's literally burning behind us, I think only makes it worse. Because when we keep darkness in the dark, it flourishes. But when we shine light on it, it flees. And I think to me, those are two of the biggest things right now. Could we focus on changing the direction of tech? Could we get more leaders in tech space? I know I'm involved in trying to create some forums of influencers to help shape. Sure, we can do those things too, but I think there's just some really fundamental basics right now that we need to get out of the way first.
So just having this conversation is a win. Educating ourselves is a win. And I'd encourage folks to check out your podcast. I'll link to it below. Your weekly cultural update is fantastic on AI, not just this issue, but other issues on business and culture. So talking about it is huge. There's a balance between, I want to talk about this, and I have grave concern about pornography and how it's affecting people and society negatively. But I also don't want to respond to people where they think Sean is a Pharisee and he's going to be judgmental, and somebody says they fell in love with a chatbot, which is only going to increase more. Where I respond and go, you? Oh my goodness, how did that happen? Well, that just shames the person and shuts down conversation. So one thing Christians can really do is just be judgmental, make judgments about right and wrong and things that are sexually mistaken, but be non-judgmental. When we talk with people, it's our job to listen and love and care for them as human beings. And frankly, we don't always do that great in the church. That's for sure. Now, before we started, you mentioned to me, I don't know that I realized this. You said your wife is expecting child number 8. How old is your oldest, Christopher?
13.
13. Okay. So presumably you've talked about this, maybe with your 13-year-old, maybe others. What advice would you give to parents? When do you talk? How do you talk about not only issues of sexuality, but specifically, they're not, I guess you might say Gen Z grew up in the first digitally native generation. This generation is now growing up in the first digitally AI native generation, where it's ubiquitous in everything you experience. So how can
Yep.
parents talk about this?
I think one of the things that I experienced as a kid that actually set me on a really negative course was my parents just avoided it. I mean, I was a total
Mm,
tech head. I had computers. I was downstairs playing with the internet at hours I shouldn't have been doing it, with no oversight. And my parents were like, "Well, I don't understand this whole internet thing and whatever." And Christopher says he's just doing these things at 4 a.m, and I'm sure it's fine. And I think there can be this concern as parents to go, "But I don't understand it. So I don't know how to talk with my kids about it." And so I think that goes back to one, learn about it. I mean, you don't need to know all the ins and outs of it, but learn about it. But I think, every night I spend several hours with my kids after dinner,
mm,
and we just sit and we just talk about life, about what's going on and what's happening. And we glance through YouTube news just to say, what
mm,
are the latest happenings that are going on here? And I treat them like little human beings who they understand this stuff, they know this stuff,
mm,
and they have questions. And we talk about some of the hard stuff. And when we read through the Bible, we don't skim over Jehu and some of these stories where you go, "Oh, that's kind of like uncomfortable." But I let them ask questions about it. And what I found is, and this, I say this to non-believers and believers, whether you adhere to the worldview, there is tremendous wisdom in the Bible, and reading it opens up a lot of dialogue with this. And so with my kids, we talk about this stuff, and I find just engaging in conversation, not as the "I'm your dad, I need to tell you these things," but I'm here to talk to you as a human being and understand what's
mm,
going on in your world and what are you struggling with and how do you feel about this? What do you think's ahead? They
mm.
open up and have invited me into their world. They invite me to their Minecraft servers.
I
These
love it.
things. And so I learn the culture that they're in. And that actually gives me opportunity to, like, experience it with them and warn them of stuff. And one of the things that's cool about it is I'm the first to go, "I don't know. I don't have the answers, but let's learn it together." And that's been a really positive thing that I think parents can do, is go, maybe your kids don't know, or maybe you don't know the answers. Well, have those conversations and then do some experimentation and learn together on what the answers might be. And I know for me, having a whole bundle of kids, it's paid dividends.
I was talking with a young man at a Christian conference that I speak at regularly, and he was profoundly struggling with pornography. And he's like, "My dad, who's a pastor, just never even talked about this, never opened the communication lines." So just talking about having this conversation itself is a win, but you're doing it in the context of relationship. And
Yeah.
so, really simply put, I've been studying faith transmission for years, the work by Vern Bankston and Christian Smith and others. And there's no formula for passing on your faith because people have free will. But really, to do so, step number one, you got to model a faith that your kids find valuable and attractive. If you say one thing and do another, they're not going to listen to you. Second, build relationships with your kids. Build relationships with your kids. And then third, have meaningful conversations with them about spiritual things. That's really the formula,
Yeah.
including sexuality. So
Yeah.
growing up in our family in the 80s, my dad was leading this campaign called Why Wait? And I was like 10 years old, and we would talk about at the dinner table, like the latest studies on STDs and condoms, like we just did. So it doesn't make me blush to talk about this stuff.
No.
Other people do, and I forget that. I'm like, let's just talk, kids. And we
Right.
have that line of communication. And so the study's showing that kids don't go to their pastor first. They don't go to their parents first. They don't go to their friends. They're going to TikTok and they're going to YouTube and they're going to other
Yeah.
social media platforms now being manipulated by AI for their information. And yet it's parents who have the most significant influence on their kids. So build relationships, model a faith in your marriage, right? I think one of the most powerful things kids can do, I'm sorry, not kids can do, parents can do, is to just model a marriage worth emulating. My
Yeah.
dad said to me growing up, and I actually heard, believe it or not, Abraham Lincoln and John Wooden say similar things in different contexts, if I remember correctly, that a kid's security comes from knowing his mom and dad love each other and will never leave each other.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that to put shame on anybody who's single.
No.
Please don't hear that. If that's the challenge you have, I have nothing but compassion and grace for you. But if we want to pass it on to our kids, build and focus on that relationship, have the conversation, build relationships with them early. There's a ton of
The one
comments.
other
Go
thing I
ahead,
would add to this
please.
is, as a parent, I think there's sometimes is this not sometimes there's tremendous pressure to get it all figured out before you talk to your kids about it. And going back to the
Amen.
study we referenced before, that how many dads and how many moms are struggling with this, which probably makes it that much harder to talk to your kids because you're like, how can I talk to them when this is something that has a stranglehold in my life? And I will say, you don't, not only just in parenting, but in business and everything, I have found so much that being vulnerable about your own weaknesses actually invites that kind of relationship. And so, like,
Amen.
I've been open with my kids that I was their age when I started struggling with this. And they know how I ended up going down this path and how destructive it was in my life. So for me, it's not like daddy's got it all figured out and now that I'm past this, what it's like, no, I know what you're going through at 13. I remember what it was like to go through that, and I failed, and I don't want you to fail. And I think that kind of vulnerability is really hard sometimes as a parent.
That's really freeing to say you don't have it figured out. If kids ask a question, don't make up an answer if you don't know. Just say, great question. Let's talk about it. Let's do some research. Let's figure it out. What does the Bible say? What does an expert say? Just that kind of conversation gives kids permission to ask, to wrestle, to work through things and know that those questions are normal and they're not crazy. Now, two last things. I got a last question for you that came from Mitchell again. He's
Sure.
nailing it with these good questions. But first, I'd say if you're watching this, I don't say this a lot because it can sound like self-promoting, but I would encourage you, if there's a parent who has kids wrestling with this, your pastor, if they don't talk about this or they do, send them a link to this. This is literally changing everything with sexuality. And I think we're on the cusp of a new sexual revolution, and we've got to talk about it, as uncomfortable as it may be, and be in a position to make moral judgments, but also be a community of grace and kindness and love. I think, Christopher, before I ask you this last question, if, like you said, this is speeding up the process of people getting to the stage of addiction that took longer in the past, that means there might be more people broken by this, hurting by this, realize that deep in their hearts, something like pornography is a substitute and doesn't help them better love somebody. The question is, will they turn to Christians if we're living in a certain way that's attractive to them? And will the church be a place where they'll be quick to judge them, or we will love them and present what God really says brings happiness? So in some sense, I hate to say it this way, but this is an opportunity for the church to live differently, to speak truth to our culture that needs to hear truth about this, but also to be a place that can be a safe place for people hurting, broken by this, to grow and get better. Last question for you, my friend. It's this. Mitchell says, what would you say to a Christian who says, I'm lonely, I would rather be in a relationship with a chat bot than nobody, even if I know it's not real? What would you say, Christopher?
So I think for me, my response, I haven't had that exact question, but I've had things similar, is I would really want to understand why. Where's that coming from? Because I can empathize with what I know is behind every single one of those questions. Loneliness sucks. Relationships are very complicated, and it can feel like, but if I make myself vulnerable, I'm going to get hurt. And isn't this just easier? Because AI is never going to let me down. It's always going to give me what I want. And so I understand on the surface where a lot of this stuff comes from. And so I think rather than arguing with someone and saying, well, no, you're wrong, and here's all the reasons you're wrong, I think there's so much behind that question that I would actually want to understand that person and their journey and understand why would you want to substitute the beauty and wonder of relationship, the beauty and wonder that God has created in sexuality? Why would you want the cheap substitute? And not in a condescending, I can't believe you, but like, what do you think you're going to get? Because I've seen enough to say, you're going to be on the other side and it's going to be empty. And it's going to be a loneliness and emptiness that you think will be satisfied. That's going to leave you even worse than you are today. But obviously you don't think that way right now. So what is it that you're missing?
That's great. There's a lot of people I wouldn't have floated this question to fresh, but I knew you could handle it with graciousness and kindness. I would say to this person, I'd say, hey, thanks for opening up and sharing that with me. I'm honored you're asking this question. I imagine there's some shame that's behind it where you think people are going to say you're crazy to open up and share this. I'd say, tell me some of the backstory. Help me understand when you started to feel like a chatbot is your only opportunity. Those desires you have to know and be known are good God-given desires. The deepest desire of the human heart, I'm convinced, is not for money. It's not for fame. It's to know and be known, intimacy. Real relationships bring more joy in life than anything else. So this yearning of which you're leaning for a chatbot to, that is a good yearning. Let's talk about how a chatbot ultimately is not going to fulfill that. And then let's look at your life and see if there's other things we can do that will build the real relationships that you need through the church, through clubs, through other believers. But I'm going to try to process and see where that person is relationally rather than jump in and say something like, you're crazy. Why would you look at a chatbot? Shame on you. Like that is just not going to help. That's how I would respond.
Because what I've seen with it is often this stuff is fueled by voids and hurt. And so even I had, like I said, a similar conversation with somebody, and it was because they had been so badly hurt by people that trusting another human being just felt impossible. And AI seemed like the only hope. And they just wept, and we were just worked through the grief of that. And that had to happen to be able to move forward, because even that interaction in and of itself showed, isn't the value of this conversation the fact I care enough about you to grieve with you through the pain that you're going through right now? Doesn't that give you a little glimmer of, wouldn't you rather have that than a chatbot that just robotically says back whatever you want?
Christopher, tell us about your podcast. I think I said earlier that I listen to it regularly. You're not speaking specifically to a Christian audience, but you weave in just naturally and not manipulatively at all, just naturally. Sometimes you say, hey, I'm a Christian. I'm going to speak as a Christian. But I listen to it because you have this world like we've seen today, this understanding of AI in business and sometimes sexuality and in other worlds. Tell us a little bit about it, because I hope people will actually start following and listening along.
Yeah, so it was a journey I started back 5 years ago. Because I was the person who people would reach out to try and make sense of what was going on in the business and technology world. And I don't know, God apparently gifted me with a way of being bilingual in those things. And so it was something I started back in the day just to have conversations to help make sense of it. And over time, I couldn't keep having those one-off conversations. And so when my wife was in labor with number 5, I said, I think I'm going to do a live stream where I'm going to do this. And she said, can we talk about that later? Now might not be the best time to have that conversation. But I have since stuck with that. And that really has been my commitment, is to just help people understand what's going on, not necessarily to make a judgment about it or to say you need to agree with me on it, but just to say, hey, here's the complexity. And what I can say to your point about AI and algorithms is typically those nuanced, complex approaches to things, they don't make the headlines because that's not the clickbaity stuff. And so that's why I do it. But really my goal is to change the world for the better, because it's scary and I get it. It's extremely terrifying, and especially when you don't know what you're dealing with.
And the title of the podcast is what, so folks can find it?
Yeah, if you're listening to as a podcast, it's Future Focused with Christopher Lind. And then I have a YouTube channel that I make clips and other things related to it. And that's Christopher Lind.
Future Focused with Christopher Lind. Check it out. And while you're at it, make sure you hit subscribe if you've been enjoying this live channel, and leave a comment. Let me know if you want me to do more here. I haven't done this in 8 months for a lot of different reasons, but I'm open to do it more consistently if it helps you and you enjoy it. I would shift and pivot back to doing that, but want your feedback. I'll come back and read these comments of what you think on a range of topics, if that's helpful. As you're watching, I just learned, Christopher, that one of my colleagues at Biola, Maretu Gutta, who is a PhD in philosophy, brilliant, written some top-level books, is teaching a class on apologetics and AI this fall in our apologetics program. He told me Wednesday when we were recording podcasts. So if you like this topic and apologetics, check out Biola Apologetics, Talbot School of Theology, and I also teach a class every couple of years on a biblical view of sexuality, which intersects with some of these ideas as well. Christopher, hang after. I want to say goodbye, but the rest of you, thanks for watching. Thanks for being a part of this. And I'd be honored if you consider sharing this with a friend, Christian or not, because I'm not an alarmist, but man, this stuff concerns me profoundly as a dad and a professor. We need to get the word out. All right, we'll see everybody soon. Oh, and by the way, I've got a podcast coming up. I just interviewed, it's been 20 years since the Indian Ocean tsunami. And right before this, I finished an interview I'm going to post next week with a survivor who literally recounts a supernatural experience. She believed God used that. She lost her family, but it brought her to faith. And when I clicked on with Christopher, I was emotionally jarred because it was such a compelling story. So look for that next week. That's coming out.
Darkness is not the absence of light. It is more uncontrollable and sinister. You were there, waiting. Because the darkness is not dark to you. At least, not always. The coming darkness was too deep for us to grasp.
It would appear that we now want the same thing as Pilate.
Senior leaders in every district should question and expose Jesus.
I just can't stop seeing how we could be doing things faster and more efficiently.
You deserve a stipend for your specialized work. You can at least make sure that you have resources to keep the mission going.
My ledgers are in the red. I told you to make life difficult for the followers of Jesus.
It is on this rock that I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it.
This infernal chaos. Why can no one control these people? What just happened to all of you? It's about to get worse.
Now that I'm here, physical death does not interrupt our eternal life. Lazarus! Come out!
I remember you wishing there could be another way. And looking back, I do too. I still don't know why it has to be this way. The bitter often mingled with the sweet. You told us it would be like that. Was how you lived. The man of sorrows. Acquainted with grief.